Machine webinar to learn more about the true cost of war and defunding the Pentagon budget. My name is Carley Towne. I'm a national co-director for Codepink, which is a women-led grassroots anti-war organization. I help run our Divest from the War Machine campaign, which demands that our cities, our public employee pension funds, our universities, individual investors, retirement funds, and other financial institutions stop investing in companies that supply and prop up the US war machine. We also demand that our politicians stop taking campaign contributions from weapons manufacturers so they're not beholden to them when they vote to authorize funding for war. So today, we're really going to focus on that last topic quite a bit, funding for war. And I'm extremely happy to welcome Heidi Peltier to our conversation today. Welcome, Heidi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, and Heidi is director of the 20 Years of War, a Cost of War research series in partnership with the Party Center at Boston University. She has written extensively on the employment impacts of public spending, including the areas of green growth, as well as demilitarization. Her research focuses on how the public sector can serve the public good, including by putting the economy on a path towards sustainable development, as well as demilitarizing federal spending in order to shift funds to other areas of public interest. She has consulted with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, the International Labor Organization, the US Department of Energy, and various other organizations. So you'll understand why I'm so excited to get a chance to speak with her today. And again, thank you so much for joining us, Heidi. Really excited to talk to you today. So our topic really centers on getting our heads around what we spend on war and US militarism. So let's just dive right in, Heidi. First, can you give us just a breakdown of how much money we allocate to the Pentagon every year?
Sure. Well, the past few years, we've allocated more than $700 billion a year, which is half of all discretionary spending. So discretionary spending being the spending that Congress makes decisions about to authorize amounts every year. So 2019, we spent about $712 billion. This year, it's around 720, that's 721. Next year, we're on track to potentially spend $740 billion. And I'll mention, that people see all kinds of different estimates about defense spending, and there are different ways of categorizing defense spending. So these estimates that are 700 billion and change. That's just for the Department of Defense. And there are other defense-related expenses through the federal government, like for the Department of Energy, which has atomic energy activities. There are defense-related expenses in the FBI. If we also include Homeland Security spending and spending for veteran services and benefits, the cost of the debt that we pay for war and military expenses, if we add all those together, then we get over $1 trillion. So what some call the militarized budget, including National Priorities Project and the Project on Government Oversight, they refer to this as the militarized budget. That adds up to over $1 trillion a year that we're spending.
Wow, okay, right. So you mentioned, right, that the way that we measure this depends on what we include or don't include when we talk about military spending. But how does that number, that 700 billion and change number, compare to military spending by other countries, for example?
Right, yeah, that's a good question. So the US actually spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined, the next 10 biggest military spenders combined. So that includes China. We spend 3 times as much as China does on its military. We spend 10 times as much as Russia. I was looking at the numbers as a percentage of global military spending. The US spends 38% of global military spending, and we have 4% of the world's population.
Wow. Right. I think, yeah, putting it in that context for people, I think really shows the disproportionate amount of money that we spend compared to other countries. But also within the context of the United States, how does this compare to other federal spending within the United States?
Yeah, good question. So the only thing that we spend more on than the Department of Defense is Social Security. We spend a little bit more right now on Social Security with a growing and aging population. That spending has been increasing. Military spending has been increasing regardless of the size of the population or the needs of the military. Frankly, it's been increasing about 5% a year for the past 50 years or more. And when we look at how much we spend on the military compared to everything else, we spend, almost 4 times as much as we do on education, training, and social services. If we combine those categories, we spend 15 times as much as we do on natural resources and conservation. We spend, I recently gave a talk at MIT, so I was looking at how much we spend on general science and scientific research, and we spend 48 times as much on the military as we do on general science and basic research. So this gives us a sense of how our budget reflects our priorities, or whether it does reflect our priorities is a question, really.
Right. And I think that's, again, really important to put that into context. And when we talk about the fact that we spend, over 700 billion on the Pentagon compared to other programs, what is our money actually going to? What does that budget actually encompass when we're talking about that amount of money?
Right. Well, about 20% of it, about a fifth of it, is for personnel costs. And then the rest goes to operations and maintenance, construction costs, procurement, so purchases of weapon systems and fuel and ammunition and clothing and so on. And out of our total military budget, the Department of Defense budget, half of that goes to contractors. And this, so I wrote a paper that came out this past June, June 2020, looking at the issue of military contracting. And one of the reasons I looked into that was seeing some data that made me realize that spending on contractors has really been growing. But now if we look at, if we put together a few of these facts, that half of the Department of Defense spending goes to contractors, and half of federal defense discretionary spending goes to the military, that means that a quarter of all discretionary spending in the US is going to military contractors.
Wow. That's a startling statistic that I don't think most people know, right? A quarter of our money goes to that. I guess my question would also be about defense contractors, right? Why are they so expensive? Why does half of our Pentagon budget go to them?
Well, partly half of our budget goes to them because they have political power and spend a lot of money on lobbying to make sure that they get contracts. And contracts are widely dispersed. So every state in the US has military contract dollars, has firms that are located there, prime contractors, so that the main contractor with the government, then they can subcontract out to other firms, and subcontractors are located in every state and are often chosen strategically to disperse money widely. Almost every congressional district has contract dollars, and this means there's a lot of support for contract dollars flowing from tax collections to the military contractors. But to answer your question about why it's so expensive, one of the things that I've learned in looking at some of the data on contracting and looking at the history of contracting is that the idea of privatization is that market competition will incentivize firms to lower costs and increase quality compared to the public sector, which is operating basically like a monopoly. And so you get this real push in the 70s and 80s, what some call neoliberalism, which is this real push to privatize as much of government as possible. And military contracting was sold as this idea of let's save money by using private firms. And when it comes to military contracting, I don't like to use the term privatize because I don't think that private really describes what it is. These are firms that use public dollars. They serve a public purpose. They're, at least in theory, subject to public oversight. So I prefer to use the term commercialize rather than privatize. But what we see is that because of the nature of the contracts, which I can get into, but I won't unless you ask, because it gets kind of into the weeds a little bit, but because of the nature of the contracts, the fact that many contracts are cost type contracts where the contractors have no incentive to reduce costs because they pass all those costs on to the government and to the taxpayer. So there are not these cost reducing pressures just because of the nature of the contracting system. And then there are lots of ways that contractors essentially have monopolies, where they have sole supplier agreements, they have lifetime service contracts. And so what we've done, rather than shift from a public monopoly into commercial private competitive firms, we basically have shifted from public monopoly to commercial monopoly. So there's no cost reducing forces. And on top of that, you have the profit of the contractors. So in the end, the total bill to the government is higher than it would be if they just produced in-house.
Right. I mean, we talk about this all the time at Codepink, the fact that there is profit to be made by going to war, right, and continuing war. Now, something that I'm interested in as well is, what are the kinds of services that these contractors are providing? Like, what is it what is included in that?
Well, that's a good question, because that's one of the things we've seen over the last 2-3 decades is a real shift from contractors that traditionally had been manufacturers selling weapon systems and other goods. There's really been an increase in the services that contractors are providing, including in war zones. So you have everything from dining services to fuel supply to infrastructure, energy provision, construction, and also, armed patrol services, guard services, things like that, where contractors are increasingly replacing, not just reinforcing, but also replacing troops overseas. And taking on a lot of the responsibilities that previously had been part of the military itself.
Right. And I mean, I think that's an important point that I wanted to get to. Two things, really. Well, first, how does that kind of over-reliance on private military contractors kind of change the public's understanding of what it means to go to war, kind of the cost of war overall?
Yeah, good question. So I have come to call military contracting the camo economy, the camouflage economy, because all kinds of things are hidden by using contractors. So the financial cost and the human costs of war are hidden when we don't have good records of where contract dollars are flowing, who is getting contracts that are contracted and subcontracted, and sometimes the trail of where the money is going is lost. And then just the number of people going to war and the number of people being injured or killed in war is not nearly as public with contractors as it is with troops. So, we can hear about, troop caps, like the reductions on the number of troops that are going abroad to fight wars, but the number of contractors can increase even if the number of troops is decreasing. So it hides from the public view how many people are going to war, and there's not the same public recognition of injury and death for contractors as there are for troops. There was a paper that came out with the Cost of War project last year, I think it was December 2019, called The Human Toll of the 9/11 wars and post 9/11 wars. And what the authors, Nita Crawford and Catherine Lutz, found was that out of the US deaths, there were more contractor deaths than troop deaths, 8,000 compared to 7,000. And when we look at just the numbers of troops and the numbers of contractors, there's been a growing ratio of contractors to troops over the past couple of decades. And now we have many more contractors than troops. The last estimate I saw was about 53,000 contractors in the Middle East to 35,000 troops. So, 1.5 contractors for every service member.
Wow, yeah, I didn't know that. And I think a lot of people don't realize how much we're relying on these contractors to do a whole range of things that we used to expect, obviously, the military to do. And I think that combined with this idea that for a lot of people, the wars that we're engaged in are out of sight, out of mind. And that obviously is a big contributing factor. So on this topic, though, I did want to talk a little bit more and switch gears a little bit about a common argument that's made around military spending, which is, that keeping the Pentagon budget so high and making sure we funnel money to these defense contractors is because that spending is good for job creation. That spending is really great for job creation around the country. But, what are the actual employment impacts of Pentagon spending, and how does that compare to other industries?
So it's important to frame that question in that way, because if we just ask the question, which is, I think, historically how the question was asked, does military spending create jobs? The answer is yes. Does it create a lot of jobs? The answer is still yes. So the real question is, what's the alternative? If we were spending millions or billions of dollars on the military versus other sectors, where's the greatest impact on employment? And that's actually one of the questions that led me into starting on some of this research. So I've been the co-director or the director of the 20 Years of War project since about a year ago at Boston University, and that's an outshoot of the Cost of War project that's been at Brown University since 2010. And starting in 2010, I every 2-3 years would write a paper with that project looking at this employment question, because this was one of the motivating questions for me. It's not just how many jobs do we get with military spending, but how many jobs do we get compared to spending in education or healthcare or clean energy or infrastructure or other categories that are important to the public, important to the voters, important for the public good, important for the environment, and so on. And so what I found, the most recent data that I looked at, for every $1 million of spending, we create about 7 jobs in the military, a little bit less than that, and about 10 jobs in clean energy or infrastructure. We create even more jobs in healthcare, 14 and change, and even more in education, 15 and change. So healthcare and education create twice as many jobs as military spending for the same number of dollars. And education and clean energy and infrastructure create about 40% more jobs. So all of these categories that I mentioned are better job creators than military spending.
Right, and I think that's another really important point to say, right? Because, I think we come up against that argument all the time. And like you said, people don't compare it to other industries that we could be and should be investing in. Obviously, we're facing a climate crisis. We should be investing in these sort of jobs that don't necessarily cause more or add to the current climate crisis. So that's a really important point. And we talked a little bit at the top about just talking about the Pentagon doesn't tell us the whole story. You said we spend about $1 trillion every year on militarism total, including the Pentagon budget. But, how much have we spent on war since 9/11 alone? And how does that compare to the or can you put that into context around the current conversations we're having around a COVID-19 stimulus package, or spending to help people get out of the horrible situation they've been placed in because of the pandemic?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Nita Crawford, who's one of the co-directors of the Cost of War project, has done some really good estimates that she updates every year on the cost of the post 9/11 wars. And the most recent one, which was now about a year ago, gave the total of post 9/11 spending as $6.4 trillion. So if we look again, different numbers out there for what we spend on war. And if you look at just, Department of Defense estimates on the war, they are much lower than that. And one of the missions of the Cost of War project is to really look at the full costs, the budgetary costs, in addition to other costs like human costs and costs on transparency and so on. But what Nita Crawford's paper does is put together how much we've spent on overseas contingency operations, OCO, which is the war budget, additions to the base budget of the Pentagon. So what they're spending over and above what they would spend just in peacetime. Homeland Security spending, the spending on the debt that we've taken on for the war, spending for veterans, veterans care related to the post 9/11 wars. And if you add all that up together, that's about 5.4 trillion. And then if you look at what we will need to pay for the costs for veteran care for the post 9/11 vets going forward, there's at least another $1 trillion that will be obligated to spend for medical care. So that brings us up to 6.4 trillion just for the post 9/11 wars.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, so, I think having that number in mind and also understanding, obviously, beyond just the economic cost, of course, of war that we have engaged in since 9/11, understanding that number in the context of what politicians are offering in terms of a COVID-19 relief package, which doesn't even approach the amount of money we spent on disastrous wars. It's really important for people to have that context. So I appreciate that. Another thing, that we're coming towards the end here, and just wanted to end maybe on a lighter note. We've talked a lot about what we actually spend on war, and you've gone into great detail about that. But something I wanted to talk about was how can our federal budget better aligned with human needs? And if you say you were in charge of allocating that money, how could we do so to have better outcomes than we do now?
Well, I would shift some of the military spending into some of the areas I mentioned when we were talking about employment numbers. So this past summer, progressives in Congress were really pushing for a 10% cut in military spending. And I think that's a good start. I think a 20% cut, ending the post 9/11 wars and reducing some of the bloat in the military budget. I think a 20% cut is could do more good for the public and that would be something like $150 billion, which could really make it would be almost enough to get greenhouse gas emissions down by to get us on a path toward 40% reduction over 10 years. So if we think about channeling, all of the budget cuts, if we were to cut the defense budget, channeling all of that into clean energy and green growth, that could really do a lot for the climate crisis. Alternatively, we could shift some of that toward clean energy and some of that toward student debt relief or other types of higher education spending, in addition to education spending at other levels. And then we've seen, of course, the importance of healthcare systems during the pandemic, and certainly there is a need for more people to become insured, and various places where we could channel funds toward the healthcare sector.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I think you're so right. Earlier this year, and at Codepink and other organizations were all on board to support Representatives Mark Pocan and Barbara Lee to cut the Pentagon budget by 10%. Of course, that effort failed, but it was historic, and they are building on the power that they built in Congress, and they've started a defense spending reduction caucus, which is the first in history, as far as I understand. So we are working towards this, and that's why it's so important to talk to people like you who have so much knowledge about the Pentagon budget and what it actually encompasses. So I really appreciate your time today, Heidi. Before we log off, I did want to ask, where can people follow your work or follow you to learn more about all of the excellent research you're doing?
Sure. Well, I'm at Boston University at the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. That's PARDEE. So if you Google Heidi Peltier Pardee, you can find me there. But the Costs of War project, which is at Brown and Boston Universities, has a website. It's www.costsofwar, and costs are plural, so costsofwar.org. And you can find my paper there on contracting. I also wrote a paper earlier this year looking at the interest payments from the debt we're taking on for the war, which is also, just to mention, also one of the hidden costs of war, is that we're pushing the cost of war out to future generations by not taxing to pay for the war, by not issuing war bonds and other things that have traditionally been done. We're just paying for the war through debt. So that pushes, it'll increase our interest payment obligations and increase the burden to future generations. So I just wanted to mention that because we didn't happen to cover it. But so yeah, costofwar.org. You can find all our papers and links to other things, or the Boston University Pardee Center.
Perfect. Thank you. And appreciate you mentioning that at the end there. I mean, we'll have to have you on again. All of your research is excellent. And I think everyone here should definitely go to the website, and we'll make sure everyone here receives it as well. It's really, really interesting work and extremely important. So thank you so much, Heidi, for a really informative conversation today. I think a lot of people, even if you're active within the peace movement, learned quite a bit about really what our Pentagon budget encompasses, and really the true cost of war. And we did mention at the end there the efforts that are being taken on right now in Congress to reduce the Pentagon budget. And we did mention that our Congress people had the opportunity to vote to cut the Pentagon budget by 10% earlier this year. And if you want to learn more about whether or not your congressperson voted to cut the Pentagon budget by 10%, and more importantly, how you can hold them accountable, you can go to codepink.org/defundwar to learn more about how you can take action right now to hold your representatives accountable for either cutting the Pentagon budget or voting to cut the Pentagon budget, or failing to vote to cut the Pentagon budget earlier this year, even in the midst of a global pandemic, right? So with that, I want to thank you again, Heidi, for a really wonderful conversation. And I want to say to everyone who joined us, thank you so much, and have a great rest of your night.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm still live.